Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Honoring Grief and Increasing Resiliency Among Long-Term Care Staff. My name is Michelle Fleming and I'm a knowledge broker with the Ontario CLRI at Bruyère. I will be moderating the webinar today. The Ontario CLRI works to strengthen the quality of care and living for residents across the province through training, education, and knowledge mobilization. Before we take a deep dive into how to support team members through grief experienced as professional caregivers, I wanted to cover a few logistical pieces. We will take questions at the end for the last 15 minutes of the webinar. If you have questions throughout, please type them in the question box. We can also chat with you through that box live if you're having any technical difficulties. I'd also like to mention that the slides are available for download in PDF, as well as a workbook that has been developed by the Champlain Hospice Palliative Care Program to facilitate your own deeper exploration of this topic. We are delighted today to be partnering with the CHPCP to get this important information to folks working in the long-term care sector. Our presenter today is Tara Cohen. Tara is a registered social worker who is deeply committed to supporting individuals in achieving their optimal quality of life throughout their life journey. Working as program manager in health systems planning at the CHPCP, Tara encourages collaboration, integration, and wellness across a variety of settings and populations using a trauma-informed care perspective and mindfulness. Her hope is to attend to the needs and suffering of individuals and families as they walk their unique and collective paths through life, including illness, dying, and death. Over to you, Tara.
Thanks, Michelle. First, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me here today. And I wanted to acknowledge that some people may be expecting to have Pam Grassa, my colleague, here as well. But unfortunately, last minute, she's not able to attend. So I did want to mention that the work she has done is very present in the exercises and the slides that we'll be going through today. So in terms of a starting point, we have a little bit of a survey here. The question I'm hoping that participants could answer is, how long have you worked in long-term care? All right, so thank you. So I'm taking a quick look and I see that 44% of people participating right now have been in long-term care 0 to 5 years, 25, 6 to 10 years, 16% 11 to 15 years, 4% 6 to 20, and 11% over 20 years. So that's pretty awesome. If Pam were here today, and if we were all in the same room, Pam would have everybody line up so we have a visual of this range. But what's really exciting and interesting to think about when we're looking at how long people have worked in long-term care is a recognition that people who are just coming in are coming with new ideas and new excitement, and people who have been around for longer periods of time are going to have a certain expertise and wisdom. So there's something to be gained from everybody and the different points of entry and where you're at in your career and working in long-term care. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. All right, so we're going to take the next few minutes and talk a little bit just around definitions, just to make sure that we're all working from the same language. Today, the presentation is about honoring grief. So it's really important to understand what we're looking at when we're talking about grief. So grief includes feelings and thoughts experienced following a loss. So grief is totally natural. It's not an illness. It's not something that needs to be treated or responded to as though it's something that's inappropriate. Grief literally comes from the Latin word gravis, meaning heavy. So when we think about grief, we could sort of understand that feeling of heaviness. And grief is going to have a lot of different components to it. You may notice cognitive, emotional, physical, and the people may not necessarily even realize what they're feeling is grief. They may notice things that they're experiencing and not attribute it to grief. So often with grief, we have this idea of how we want it to work. We'd like for it to be this straight line where, we might be passing through certain stages and things are predictable and we know exactly what to expect. So we want it to work like it's the straight, easy line, but we know that grief actually works in a very different way. It's always moving and changing, and it's unpredictable. So the definition of mourning that we tend to work with is that mourning is the public face of grief. So that's the way that we often experience that public face of grief is through rituals. So it could be things like funerals, burial rites, memorial services. We may notice that people are wearing black. They're things that sort of indicate to others that we're going through a period of mourning. And bereavement, so that's a term that we often use to share that grief and mourning are taking place. So it encompasses both. During a period of bereavement, people might feel literally that they're being torn apart, and that's where the root of the word is from, that grief can really make you feel like you are splitting apart or tearing apart. Yeah. And resilience. So the other part of this webinar today is really looking at how we can increase resilience. So I heard a definition of resilience a ways back, and it included the concept of bouncing forward. I think often when we talk about resilience, we talk about resilience being the ability to face adversity and bounce back, which people usually interpret as coming back to where they were before they were experiencing this grief. What I like about bouncing forward is it sort of indicates to me that you're not coming back to where you were before, because grief changes us. So bouncing forward to me shows that you've absorbed and interpreted that experience, and you're coming to a new place, that you've integrated some of the learnings as you've gone through grief. So resilience for individuals depends on thoughts and behaviors that promote your personal assets, what you have internally, and they protect you as an individual from the negative effects from the stress that you've experienced. So just going over a couple of models of resilience. These models explain personality-based components of resilience. So there are two factors that we're just going to cover briefly now. And those two personality factors are hardiness and sense of coherence. And the research has showed that these two particular traits or parts of a personality contribute to people being more resilient. So we do know that resilience tends to develop as part of our childhoods, but it's not fixed. Due to neuroplasticity, our brains are changing, and we're able to continue to grow and change. So resilience, while often is built up during childhood, it can be built up later in life as well. So the idea of hardiness within our personality, hardiness is made up of three different personal factors. So the first factor would be commitment. Commitment meaning the tendency to see the world as an interesting and meaningful place. And control. So control as part of hardiness is having a sense of autonomy and an ability to influence your own future. So if you perceive your work environment as a place where you're able to influence, you're going to feel this sense of hardiness. And the third is challenge. In challenge, there's an enjoyment of life and living that leads you to perceive the changes in your environment as exciting and as opportunities for growth. So if you see in your workplace that you're challenged, you're going to feel hardier, which is in turn going to make you more resilient. The second personality-based component of resilience is the sense of coherence. Sense of coherence is a theoretical construct, and it reflects an individual's capacity to respond to stressful situations. So people who have this sense of people contribute to a sense of coherence if they have a confidence that whatever stimuli they encounter, be it internal stimuli, things that are happening within them, or things that are external stimuli, things that happen outside of them, but if they can interpret them as predictable and explicable, that will contribute to a sense of coherence. The second thing that they have confidence in is that they have the resources available to meet the demands produced by the stimuli. So they're able to cope with the situation. So that's a manageability. And then the third is that they interpret things to have that the challenges are worthy of investment and engagement. So that's a sense of meaningfulness. If they see that these challenges in their environment are really worthy of figuring out and working with. So those are some of the resilience factors that we look at and work with people. And especially when you're working with people with illness who are dying, and where people have died, these are the different things that we could help contribute to improving, so that people are feeling stronger as staff working with people in these different settings. So the next question I have for you, because we're trying to get things out into the open, so I'm kind of curious and hoping you could respond to this question. Do you talk openly about grief in your workplace? So if you could take the next 45 seconds or so and answer this question, that would be great. Okay, so thank you for that. So I'm seeing that 50% have indicated not often, that there's not a lot of dialogue about grief in your workplace, maybe sometimes with coworkers. And 38% have said that fairly often you talk with coworkers. So that's really important to know. And what we're really hoping to do is to make these conversations about grief much more commonplace in the work setting. And while it's great that, sometimes these happen informally, we're really trying to advocate for these conversations being a regular practice, because we know that grief is present in long-term care. And there's no way it can't be, right? Because you're human beings working with others in difficult situations. So we know that the grief is there, and we're really hoping through these conversations to be able to bring these conversations out into the forefront, and for there to be an understanding of how important it really is to be able to share grief. So what I'm going to ask now is going to require a little bit of courage, and I love this definition of courage by Brené Brown. She says that courage is to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. So in the work I do, I'm not typically doing a webinar where I can interact with people, so this is a little bit unusual and different for me, but I am going to ask you to sort of acknowledge that this work does take courage, and it does take a level of vulnerability. And I'm kind of hoping that we could take these next few minutes and sort of settle into that and think about that with a very short mindfulness practice. So while we're not together in the same room, we're going to give this a shot. What I'm hoping that everybody will do is just get comfortable in your chair. Just finding a spot where you're sitting erect, your spine is straight but not stiff, feeling your feet on the ground. Yeah, so just settling in, having your hands where it's comfortable for you, either on your lap or beside you. Just beginning to notice your body sitting here. And now just turning your attention and your awareness to your breath. You could have your eyes open, your eyes closed, whatever feels good to you. But turning your attention to your breath. Just beginning to notice your breath. Not looking to change it in any way. Just allowing the breath to breathe itself. And breathing in, knowing that you're breathing in. And breathing out. Just know that you're breathing out. And perhaps beginning to take notice of where the breath is most prominent for you. It could be the cool air at your nostrils as you breathe in, and the warm air at your nostrils as you breathe out. It could be the rise and fall of your chest, or the expansion and contraction of your belly. And just following your breath for the next few breaths, trying to trace the journey of the breath your inhale and your exhale. And if your mind wanders off, that's okay. That's what minds do. Just acknowledging that your mind has wandered, and as best you can, bringing it back to the breath. And if you start to think, this is silly, why are we doing this? That's okay. Just noticing that those thoughts have come up, allowing them to go, trying not to judge them in any way. And again, coming back to your breath. All right, taking just a couple of final breaths here with an appreciation of taking this time to notice what's coming up within you, in your body, your emotions, your sensations, your thoughts, and bringing your attention back to your computer, back to your room. All right, so thank you for participating in that. So that's just a little bit of a mindfulness exercise. And the reason I like to do that is really to bring awareness to the present moment. And in the work that you do in long-term care with people who are ill and people who are dying, it's really important to be able to have tools to reground yourself. Because being present for others, being present for your teammates, being present for yourself is really, really essential in being able to look after yourself. So mindfulness really, for those of you who have experience, you may know this might be new to some, but it really just means paying attention on purpose in a particular way, moment by moment, non-judgmentally. And we know that mindfulness practices help healthcare workers cope with stress. It helps people connect with patients or residents. And it helps overall be more compassionate and increases quality of life. So I hope you found that to be a valuable exercise. I wanted to just go over this model. This is something that, again, Pam Grasso and I had worked on, and it came from the work of Dr. Bernice Harper and Dan Siegel. And we've sort of adapted it in a way that we think might make sense to people who are working in long-term care and palliative care. So these are possible worker responses to dying and death. And it really is how you engage with that. So Dan Siegel talks a lot about the in-skull brain because he believes and shares that we have 3 centers of knowing. We have our brain in our head, our heart, and our gut. So he talks about the brain in our head as being our enskulled brain, to differentiate it from our heart and our gut. So in our enskulled brain, we tend to intellectualize things. We have our heart, where most of our emotions come from, our feelings, our gut, where we notice sensations. And then there's the concept of equanimity and integration. So Dan Siegel talks about integrating our heart, our brain, our enskulled brain, our heart, and our gut. And when we're able to integrate those 3 things as a place of knowing and a place of understanding, we're going to achieve optimal wellness for ourselves and for the people we work with. And then have a sense of equanimity, which to me really means being able to hold both the joy and the suffering that we experience on a day-to-day basis working in different sectors in healthcare. So in long-term care, you see you could experience simultaneous joy and suffering. So to further elaborate on that, the intellectualization is when you're encountering situations with residents when you're intellectualizing a situation, you're thinking, I can problem solve my way through this. You know, you're using your cognitive abilities to work through things. But your heart could say, this really hurts. This is hard. I'm at risk. You know, it feels uncomfortable. And your gut might be feeling something different. You know, we all have that sensation sometimes where our stomachs are rumbling, we feel off, our chest gets tight, it's hard to breathe. And then finally, the equanimity and the integration, right? Where we could hold all of that at once and be resilient, you know, to not shove our feelings down, to not try to push it away, to recognize through mindfulness or other practices, notice what's there for us. So we notice that we're feeling all these things, but we're able to say, like, this is okay. It's hard, but it's okay. So the other thing that we know is important as part of the discussion we've already had around resilience is reflection, right? So if we have a sense of our purpose, why we do the things we do, it really contributes to our resilience. So I would ask that we maybe take the next minute and either jot down or just reflect on these few questions. Why am I participating today? So what brought you to this webinar? Why is this of interest to you? Why did I become a? So whatever your profession is or your job, why? Why did you choose this path? And why do you continue to do the work that you do with the knowledge you have now? So just taking a few moments to reflect on that. Okay, so thanks. As I said, it's important to reflect as a way of increasing your resilience. But we know that there are other ways to increase and promote resilience. So some of the other things that you could do would be to change your perspective. So we all have a story we tell ourselves in our heads, right? When we're faced with a situation, we could be feeling frustrated or feeling ineffective or feeling just that things aren't going the way we want them to, and we have a story about it. Sometimes changing our story, recognizing that this is just what we're seeing from our lens, but that maybe that's not the experience of other people or even other people in the exact same situation. So changing that perspective can really promote your resilience. Using gratitude practices, I think we've all heard about gratitude journals or waking up and, you know, having one or two phrases of gratitude that we think of to start our day. Setting realistic goals for ourselves. Sometimes when things aren't realistic, we just feel like we're never accomplishing what we set out to do, and that could really that could be difficult. That could make us feel defeated. Making sure to celebrate successes, having compassion and self-compassion, fostering positive relationships with others, with our teammates, with you know, people that we come across. It could be families, individuals that we're working with. Practicing acceptance, and I think this is a really tough one that people, you know, that we resist and we battle situations. And I always think about when some of the mindfulness training I've done, there's the equation of pain plus resistance equals suffering. So to look at things differently and to accept, you know, I think I've used the line, it is what it is, a million times or more in my life. And that's not to be defeatist, just saying it is what it is. It really is. Like, sometimes you just have to accept a situation as it is, and not resisting it, allowing it to be, does really release some of the suffering that we create around it. Try non-attachment to outcomes. So sometimes we go into a situation being really tied into a particular outcome being the result. But if we can let go of that need for it to be a particular way and just let it be, whatever happens, happens, and just accepting that. So that's acceptance and non-attachment to a particular outcome, and sort of the same in the same. And then finally, working on self-awareness and self-discovery. And that can be really difficult, especially when we're talking about a work setting, you know? So self-awareness and self-discovery as a human being can be different in different contexts. So that might be something that you're comfortable doing at home or doing in your personal life. But I think as part of your work life, part of our work lives, we tend to distance ourselves as a way of remaining professional, keeping our professional hats on. And maybe some work settings allow for that better than others, but in the work that you're doing with real humanness, and there's a lot of emotion that comes into play in this kind of work, it's really hard to leave those emotions at the door. This comes to work with you, and we know through studies, for people to be well and to not burn out and to continue to feel engaged and happy with their work, it does require sort of tapping into some of these difficult things. So we can't tap into them until we sort of know a lot about ourselves. So why is this important in long-term care? I'm going to refer to learnings from studies done by Mary Lou Kelly and Jill Marcella. This is important in long-term care because we know that staff develop really close relationships with residents. We know that dying, death, and grief are usual experiences in the day-to-day working life in long-term care settings. And we know also that long-term care is only recently recognized as a major location of death and an important setting for hospice palliative care. So people have been dying in long-term care, but it's really just becoming, you know, some of the things that have been happening at hospice, because we know obviously that that is a major location of death, have not been happening in long-term care, but maybe some of those practices are now being seen as things that can add a lot of value. And that grief, loss, and bereavement support are important components of holistic hospice palliative care. CHPCA has a model of care where they talk about that. And as we're integrating a sort of more palliative approach to care in long-term care settings, that we really do need to be exploring grief, loss, and bereavement and how to support staff in that way. Also, in Ontario, there are no policies in long-term care that require grief and bereavement support for staff. It's not required, so it's done sort of ad hoc, right? If people choose to do it, it is done more, you know, some to a very little degree and some more often. And lack of support for grief, we know through these studies, contribute to compassion fatigue, burnout, and poor retention. And I'm sure you've all heard some of the talk about compassion fatigue and burnout. And I think the more we could look at things proactively and the more we could integrate these practices that are going to increase wellness in staff, that will honor the grief they're feeling, as the title says, honor that grief and increase resiliency, the more we can be proactive with this and the less we're going to have to deal with things like burnout. And we also know from staff that there's a perceived expectation of emotional distancing in long-term care, that this is a place of work and that they need to leave their feelings at the door. And working within a culture where there's a denial and there's silence about grief. And if we reflect back to the poll we took at the beginning, how few people are talking about it or it's happening informally, we know that it leads staff to detach from residents. They're not able to provide the care because they're trying to find that spot, right? Or you're trying to find that spot where you can engage with people, but you're trying to be distanced enough that you could cope when that person dies and you could cope with your grief. So until we are able to integrate all of this and deal well with staff grief, it's going to be difficult to not have burnout. Burnout's going to continue to happen until we address the fact that staff are human beings and are going to be having these experiences. Some of the identified needs, the grief support needs of staff would include education. So education like we're doing today, talking about definitions, talking about normalizing grief in long-term care settings, knowing that it exists. So this type of education, Additionally, we talk about peer support. How could you integrate peer support into long-term care settings where there are peer guides, that there's accessible mentoring for new staff, so that there's an expectation when staff starts. We know, again, from the attendance here today on this webinar, that there's a lot of new staff, right? So how can we work with that, with new people working in long-term care, so that their reality is meeting, that expectations and reality meet? Because if they come into long-term care not knowing that they're going to be facing death, it's going to be that much more difficult when that happens. So setting up expectations so that people can cope well. And then finally, peer support, more formal support, so that it's formalized. There are protocols in place that workers can rely on, that they know that what's going to happen after a resident has had, if there's been some sort of traumatic incident or a death over a weekend, or while they were away, if they weren't working and they've come back and a resident who they've been close with has died, that there is some sort of expected response, so people know that they'll be able to connect and grieve, and if it's debriefing or if there is access to a social worker, but there are things in place that they could count on to help them deal with their grief. So now we're really getting into emotions. If you are all here with me in the room, what I would do now is break out a pack of cards that have emotions. Each card has an emotion on it, and we would get into small groups, and everybody would have an opportunity to sit with a small group and talk about the emotions that you may be feeling. But given we're in a webinar, we don't have the opportunity to do that. But what I would ask you to do is to reflect on the fact that as a human being, you are going to feel things. So this is Plutchik's Wheel of Emotion. The way it works is the inside circle is the most intense version of that emotion, and then the next circle out are kind of the 8 emotions that Plutchik says are our core emotions. And within each flower petal, as you go out and the color lightens, that's the less intense version of the emotion. I put it here because I really think as human beings, we're not used to talking about our feelings. We don't do that. We tend to bury stuff. We tend not to talk about it. And I really think it's helpful just to have these words out there. So just being able to look at this and feel what resonates for you as you read through these words, because we don't tend to label those things. So what connects with you? What are you feeling? And then take chances and find coworkers that you trust and be able to have talks about how you're feeling with other people. So that goes back to the courage, having the courage to be seen for who you are and where you are. So I guess more technically, our emotions are labels for the sensations we feel in our bodies as a result of stimuli. So we know that things happen. Again, internal forces, external forces, those are the stimuli, and we're going to feel things as a result. Labeling the emotions, so again, looking at those words, this allows us to communicate with other people. It's going to help us, it's going to help our teammates, it'll help our relationships and our ability to work with one another. But we know that our emotions sometimes get stuck, and then it's not a good feeling, right? When we're stuck in one place and we don't know how to work through it. So being able to hold that emotion, right? So again, the mindfulness practice allows us to notice. Sometimes we'll notice the sensations first, clenching our hands, clenching our teeth, our shoulders are raised up to our ears. We may notice that before we know what's really going on with us. So just taking the time to notice how we're feeling, being able to hold it, to not be frustrated, but to just allow it to be. Allow our bodies, allow ourselves to process those feelings, to believe that in the impermanence of things continue to change, but not to shove it deep down where it's going to have a long-term impact, allowing it to come up and to deal with it. And we know that our emotions exist at work. We don't leave them at home when we get up in the morning. So, and we know in long-term care that these feelings of grief are cumulative. It's not that it gets easier in time. You don't get used to losing people that you care about. So if you're going to continue to work in settings where people are ill and people die, you're going to continue to feel those losses, and they're likely going to be magnified, not lessened. So how can we deal with this? And Pam and I have done workshops in the past where we use a lot of reflective practices, and we'll sort of talk about a few of them as we go through today. So one was that why exercise. That's one of the things we do. The other is sharing the emotion cards, reflecting on how we feel. So, that's focusing our attention, it's analyzing, and then we like to write. So there'll be another exercise later on, but all of those things help us sort of work through where we're at, working towards a place of feeling more resilient and feeling stronger and engaged in what we do. So it's important to know for yourself, and it's important to know for your teammates sometimes. The question I'm asking here for you is, when I am experiencing grief, I prefer to. So if you could take the next 45 seconds or so and just give an indication of how you experience grief and what you like to do with that, that would be great. Yeah, and if you're a kind of person who likes to do something else not listed here, feel free to write it in our chat box. It's really good for us to know what other people like to do. So yeah, taking a quick glance, we see, 30% of people like to be alone, 47% like to call a friend and talk, and then a lesser distribution of the other 3. But that's important to know for yourself. What is it that you can lean on to support yourself in difficult times, or times when you're feeling that the grief might be a little overwhelming, to make sure that you're doing what it is that you need to do to process, and also so you could support members of your team. So we have a short exercise now. This is an integration exercise where I'm going to ask you to sort of look at how you experienced. I want you to think about a resonant experience when you were deeply touched. So just in the next few seconds, bring to mind something that happened at work that really touched you. And if you could either jot down or think about how you experience that in your body, in your emotions, in your sensations, in your thoughts. And then finally, just a couple of notes of how does this live with you now? Okay, I hope that gave everybody a few minutes. A few people have shared with us, and I wanted to say thank you for sharing your experiences. I don't know if you've heard that song by Holly Cole before. It's one that I often like when I do training with volunteers who provide bereavement support. It really speaks to me in terms of just being present, right? Being there. So not looking to fix things for people. And so we can't fix things, right? So just be able to be there and allow people to go through what they need to go through in difficult times. And that counts for you as well. Just be there. And Alan Wolfelt uses the term companioning. Alan Wolfelt is a grief counselor. He's also the founder and director of the Center for Loss and Life Transition in Colorado. So companioning, so companion yourself, companion others, just being present for people. So I hope that gave you an opportunity to reflect a little bit on, an experience for you that, and in reflecting in that, that's where the healing happens, right? To bring it to the surface and just to connect with it and share it with others, to be seen, to be heard in that experience. And self-compassion. Like, I know at this part when we're all together, often this is a very emotional experience to go through, an emotional exercise. There are often tears in the room. So I like to just reflect for a moment afterwards on self-compassion. So self-compassion, in the literature, we know Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer talk about the 3 elements of self-compassion. So one is self-kindness, just holding ourselves kindly, and recognizing common humanity. So understanding that we are all human beings here in the world doing the best we can. So knowing that we are not alone in our suffering. It's a shared human experience. And then the third aspect of self-compassion being mindfulness. So noticing what comes up, neither suppressing or exaggerating our feelings. Just they are what they are, and just being with them. And then the impermanence, knowing that things are going to come and go and change. So with self-compassion, what I'd like to suggest to people throughout your day as you're encountering difficult emotions or difficult circumstances is to literally put your hands over your heart. Take your two hands, and if you want to try it now, it feels really good to put your hands over your heart and feel the warmth. And it often allows your body to just to calm itself. There's a sense our parasympathetic nervous system is just, we feel ourselves calming down to say, this is hard. This is hard. This is challenging. Say something that resonates with you, but just feeling that warmth, feeling your heartbeat, feeling present to whatever it is that's happening within you. And just breathing. Holding yourself compassionately, knowing that you're doing the best you can. Thank you. So I know that we're down to our last 4 or 5 minutes here, and I have one last activity. And in this time, these few moments, I'm going to ask if you would be willing to write, and if you're interested in sharing, you could share in the chat box what's called a 6-word story. So often I don't want to say often, in narrative medicine or in health settings, more often than before, people are using a 6-word story or a 55-word story as a way of reflecting on experiences and promoting healing. So what I'm going to ask is that you take these next 3 minutes and write a 6-word story. You could write it from a perspective of hope for your residents or hope for yourself, but just 6 words that speak to you about hope in the work that you do. So go ahead, and again, if you'd like to share them with us, we could read a few out afterwards, or we could compile something and send it out. But all right, let's go for it. All right. So thank you. Thank you for being courageous and for being vulnerable and opening yourselves up to participating in that experience and that exercise. We do have some people who share their stories with us, and I'll just read out a few because I know we have a few moments left. But death opens the gate to heaven. And another is experience grief wholeheartedly, even when difficult. Let it be, accept, be grateful. Open-minded, honest, supportive, ability to remember moving forward. And then the last one, hope I don't feel alone. So it's amazing in just 6 words, the depth of a feeling and a reflection that could be offered in just such a concise little piece. But thank you for sharing that. We've kind of reached pretty much the end. There was one last thing that I was thinking if we have the opportunity or the time to do. It would reflect back on some of the things that we shared. I had shared earlier on that we know through research that staff require support, and some of the needs would be around education. There would be education, and then things that could help people individually and things that help collectively. So I would be curious if you have things that you've done in your work settings that you want more of, what those things would be. Have you done things that are the things that have worked for you, things that haven't worked, and what would you like to see more of? Would you like to do more things around emotions at work or mindfulness at work, or collectively, would you like to see policies changed? What is it that would be helpful to you in your work settings in order to acknowledge and honor the grief you're experiencing and enable you to continue to build your resiliency? So please feel free to write any comments. And now I guess we've come to the point where the questions, we could address any questions. Okay.
Yeah, so the first question, how do you sell incorporating grief and mindfulness to staff who are medically minded and may not see its value?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's a lot. Mindfulness now is really evidence-based, right? So for the people who are truly medical minded and evidence-based, there are studies that you're able to sort of reflect on. The effects are known. The effects are known, and it does promote all of the things that I've already gone over a little bit, but there's even more. So for the person who's asked that question, please feel free to reach out to me personally, and I could share studies. I have many that I'd be happy to connect you with. Yeah.
Okay, the next question we have, how much does emotional pain bring on physical injuries in staff?
We know they're connected, so it's hard to quantify that one, but we know that grief is experienced physically. So, yeah, and I think it's hard to know exactly what grief, when you're experiencing symptoms, people may not initially connect that to grief, but often a sense of the physical injuries can be connected to an experience of heartbreak and grieving. Yeah, thank you.
What other resources do you have or seminars that you can suggest?
Okay, what are the resources? So I'd be curious to know specifically if you're looking at grief, there are lots of different books. I'd written one down actually that I was hoping to, there it is. There was a book that I recently learned about by an author, Linda Graham. The book is called Resilience, Power Practices for Bouncing Back from Disappointment, Difficulty, and Even Disaster. So again, the author is Linda Graham, and the title of the book is Resilience. It's 130 exercises, but that's one of many. There's some, if you're interested specifically in mindfulness, John Kabat-Zinn, has a few great books. I have a list of mindfulness resources that maybe, we could share those at a later date. Yeah.
Is it acceptable for staff to attend a resident's funeral?
So that's a bit of a tough one for me to answer, and I think that would depend on what the policies are at your place of work. I think they may differ. From my personal perspective, as long as it's comfortable for the family, then I would like to say yes. I think it's a beautiful thing for staff to attend a resident's funeral. Yeah.
How can you live your emotions in the workplace and remain professional at the same time?
So that's really the balancing act, right? So I think, and this is my personal belief, that it's okay to show your humanness. We're all in it together, and when you're working with people who are ill or at end of life and their families, I don't see the two as mutually exclusive. So to show that you're human and to show that you're hurting, but you're there for them and you could support them. Like I do think you need to look to support them and their needs as a priority, but it doesn't mean that you can't be sad with them. So being able to hold those together.
How much focus should be in place on the disease rather than the illness to provide a better end-of-life care?
I'm trying to sort of figure out a good answer to that. I think this is what I love about advanced care planning. So if you've had these conversations around values, wishes, and beliefs, I think a lot of that could sort of be teased out based on what's important to an individual. So when you're focusing on the disease, what's important to them? Is it important that you manage pain? Is it important? So, you need to focus on the disease to a certain extent in managing the care that's needed based on their values and wishes. But in terms of providing a better end-of-life care, that's really I guess to me, it's really knowing what's important to the people. So what's most important to them at end of life? Is it that they're, that their dignity is maintained? And if that's what it is, then what does dignity mean to them? What to them signifies dignity? And making sure that you're looking at all of those elements. I hope that's a full enough answer.
The grieving process for some begins when they come into long-term care. Do you have any useful resources for residents in long-term care who are already experiencing this loss of their independence, their health, etc.?
Yeah, so to me that speaks to the anticipatory grief, and I agree. As residents and families enter long-term care, there is already a lot of grieving that's taking place. We do on our website have brochures that are downloadable all around grief and bereavement. There is one specifically for anticipatory grief, so I encourage you to check out the resources on our website. And there's a bookshelf where you're able to access those booklets.
Are there any resources or information on peer support teams in long-term care?
That's a great question. I don't have any, but that's something I'm going to work on. On peer support teams, no, I really don't know of any. So thank you for asking that. And it's really great to know that, to think about that and how important that could be.
And I think we've got time for one more question. So this will be the last question today. Is it true that a palliative resident, a resident who is dying, is in more pain than other residents may be in?
Yeah, I think that's really dependent on the situation, right? And when I think about pain, I reflect on total pain. There's the physical pain, there's the emotional pain, there's the spiritual pain. So I think it's kind of hard to quantify. Again, I encourage bravery and courage in having these conversations openly with people, with residents, with their families. What is their experience of pain? And looking at the different ways to be able to support people, depending on what their needs are.
Okay, great. So I wanted to thank everyone in the audience for your participation and your engagement today. I want to thank Tara so much for taking time to be with us today. We do encourage you to take a few moments to complete the questionnaire that you'll receive at the end of this webinar to give us some feedback. We also always love to hear feedback about topics you'd like to learn about in the future as we're planning. Also, want to make a note that the recording of this webinar will be sent out to all registrants of the webinar within about a week. As well, we will include with that email the handouts, the PDFs, just in case you weren't able to download them from our system today. So I'd encourage you to check out the CLRI website. The link is there. Find us on Twitter. Sign up for our newsletter to find out about upcoming events that are happening in the future. So thanks so much for your time and attention, and have a wonderful day.